The next station will be Fortuna 69.
Although I've said before that I believe 2020 should have focus put on improving the current content of the game, I don't think I've elaborated any more than that. While Warframe certainly does need new content to survive, mostly because not having any new content as a free-to-play game is basically a death sentence, I'm still of the opinion that for this year, more attention should be put on fixing everything wrong with the game as it is now rather than worry about making something new to release in 6 months' time. Anyways, when it comes to what I personally think DE should focus on for 2020, I'll just go ahead and get straight to the point. Host migration. For fuck's sake, please fix host migration. I don't know why we've gone so long with this in place. Dedicated servers are definitely an option, because if you have the money to put together a convention every year for the fans, then honestly you should have no problem spending money on servers that don't make you lose connection and your loot. Seriously. Being the newest addition to the game, Railjack is naturally and most obviously a very big focus for DE to fix and improve, because Railjack is fun, but the problem is the ridiculous amount of bugs it has, the large amount of grind it has just to get a decent part, and the fact that the power of the Railjack is locked behind a Vidal reactor, only because it's capable of giving up to 100 avionics capacity. Not having one just means you're kind of boned in terms of how you can upgrade your Railjack, and that's honestly ridiculous. Riven mods are allowed to be as ridiculous as they are because they're not an integral part of the game. Despite having their own economy, Riven mods can be completely untouched by the player if they so choose to. Railjack on the other hand is part of the mainline content for Warframe, and given that DE has explicitly stated that Railjack will be required for the new war, ignoring Railjack isn't exactly an option. A good start to improving Railjack would be to allow players to automatically get loot after killing enemies instead of forcing them to fly around and pick up everything. Vacuum in normal tilesets is fine, but flying around in an open area that's thousands of meters wide just to recover loot is simply irritating. Although DE is still looking over feedback from the Vauban and Ember Reworks respectively, there are still obviously Warframes in need of attention and/or improvement. I'm not just talking about Nyx and the whole Nyx is bad meme, I'm also referring to Hydroid, who honestly needs a full-on rework, and other frames who also need attention, such as Frost, Valkyr, Chroma, and Banshee. Not all of them need a complete overhaul like Hydroid does if you ask me, but rather a simple revisit, an ability change or two, and some tweaks. Power creep affects everyone unfortunately, and Warframes are bound to lose relevance and/or power over time. Some Warframes more than others. We've been long overdue for a huge augmentary balance patch. I'm not trying to imply that DE needs to nerf the augments that are actually good, because that defeats the purpose of thinking about using augments in the first place. Augments are supposed to be viable mods that players have the option of taking depending on their needs or playstyle, by improving their gameplay experience in exchange for sacrificing a mod slot. Augments are supposed to be good, even if just in certain situations, because otherwise there's no point in giving up a mod slot for an augment that is absolutely trash. I truly have no clue as to why this isn't a thing yet. Trashusagi Tenno actually made a decent point bringing this up not too long ago. If a player is trying to get an item with an absurdly low drop rate, they should be able to play the mission it drops in for a long amount of time in order to get better chances of the item dropping, or up to a certain point in order to guarantee a drop. In other words, players shouldn't be forced to do 100 runs of the same mission in order to get an item with a 2% drop rate. They should be able to play that very same mission, but upwards of an hour, in order to increase the drop rate to something reasonable, such as 10%, or up to a certain point like 2 hours, in order to guarantee a drop. Allowing players to go for longer mission runs in hopes of getting that one drop they want would mean that enemies would get tougher as the mission goes on, and that implies a challenge. You know what happens when the enemies actually become somewhat of a threat and the loot is increased to match? Fun happens. It's that simple. At very minimum, regular loot including credit caches should scale up with mastery rank. Although I've touched on it in a previous video, there should be an actual reason to return to the plains of Eidolon and Fortuna besides the occasional tactical alert, event, or sorties. The easiest way for players that have already quote-unquote cleared the plains of Eidolon and Fortuna to go back to those respective areas would be to offer loot that is worthwhile, such as vaulted relics or brand new cosmetics. That doesn't mean that the good loot should be locked behind a 2% drop rate, because nobody wants to put up with that, especially now with the shit pile that is Railjack. The point is, even if the plains of Eidolon and Fortuna aren't connected to the rest of the game like Railjack is supposed to be later on in the future, they can at the very least offer something to entice players to come back and play. Having a team focused just on pumping out lore-related stuff for Warframe would be a welcome sight. Levirian was added to the game all the way back in August as a way to give more backstory to Warframes without having to make full-blown quests, but even that's been barely touched, as only 3 Warframes have received the Levirian treatment. Introducing new synthesis targets with lore for the game would also be a good thing, as that would give the story nerds out there some new information to digest. If anything, just publishing weekly stories or some shit from the perspective of a side character such as Ordis would be an interesting change of pace when it comes to story in Warframe. I highly doubt that DE would outright delete the Conclave, not only because it's an entire syndicate for the game, but also because Lunaro is a new game mode created exclusively for the Conclave. With that in mind, players would actually try doing Conclave stuff if Conclave were changed to be PvE instead of being PvP. PvP combat in Warframe is horrendous because of the incomprehensible amount of balancing that has to be done, so the best way to have some form of PvP would be to rework Conclave to be 2 parties of opposing players against enemies, not against each other. PvE EVP content is not new by any stretch of the imagination, and Destiny 2's Gambit mode is an example of this. Considering that Warframe is 100% based around PvE gameplay, shifting the Conclave from players fighting each other to players indirectly fighting each other by fighting computer-controlled enemies would guarantee an increase in Conclave interest. Ignoring the grind of Kuva Liches, there's absolutely no point to even touch them once you've acquired all the Kuva weapons. This is a problem, because having a long-term nemesis is actually a really cool idea. But the issue is that a Lich can be killed in a disturbingly short amount of time, and even then, they don't particularly offer anything good as a reward once slain, unless you're really into having all the cosmetics. Reworking Kuva Liches into something more reasonably challenging than killing the player for getting the wrong order of guns should be priority, but when compared to Railjack, I don't think it's high priority. Make universal medallions affect the Conclave, for fuck's sake. Literally the only reason they don't is because one single person on Twitter complained to DE Steve, and as a result Conclave is still dead, because apparently the sentiment of "I grinded for this so other players should have to do the same" is more important than having content that anyone can get involved in. Thank you for watching.